Hello and good morning, everybody. It's me, Julian. Today I wanted to offer you a short lecture, if you will, on what you might call the life of the mind, the task of philosophy, how to think like a philosopher, to put it in simpler terms. But above all, I'd also like to make an argument about the kind of life that I believe to be worth living. The unexamined life is not worth living is, of course, the famous Socratic maxim that Plato puts in his Apology. It's the sequence in which Socrates is having to face a decision between life in exile or death. And the argument that Socrates makes is that even if he were to go into exile, not being able to think and work and live freely would therefore be but a shadow of an existence. It's a very dramatic moment. It's the affirmation of a certain faith, if you will, a faith in the idea of a life of the mind, a life of critical introspection and reflection and communal learning and enrichment. And in that sense, it's a way of saying that to be truly free is to be able to live and think free. And that to choose a lesser life would therefore to be a kind of death, a symbolic death, if you will. And I think that's actually something very important, especially today, to talk about the ways in which we can use thinking and reading and learning and writing as a way to feel like the active agents of our own existence, and to see philosophy as a vehicle for that. It's the Plutarch's maxim that the mind is not a vessel to be filled, but a fire to be kindled. And so what I'd like to do in this short lecture, if you'll grant me your attention, is to talk about what you might call the task of philosophy and how anyone in that sense can live like a philosopher and think like a philosopher. In fact, I would argue very strongly against the idea that philosophy has to be a niche specialization of academic interest. I think that on a very fundamental level, to truly live a rich existence is to partake in the tradition of philosophy, which can come in different forms. But let us begin with Plato, because I think it's worth noting that Plato introduces an idea of what philosophy is that is very novel at the time, which is to say, the basic Socratic Platonic idea is that philosophy is not the process by which one proceeds from doubt to certainty, but rather in reverse, how one goes from certainty to doubt. Philosophy for Plato is a doubt-centric practice. It is to examine everything critically and to question what it is. The central philosophical question is always not what do I have yet to learn, but rather, do I really know what I think I know? How do we know what we believe we know? Therefore, philosophy from a Platonic perspective starts with a very simple inquiry. What is the nature of things? It's an ontological question. Ontology being an inquiry into the nature of things, teleology being an inquiry into the purpose of things. And here you can see a division between Plato and later Aristotle. Plato believed that if we could find the true nature of what something was, a definitional practice, if you will, we could approach its essence. Like, there's a great passage in Plato where he says, what is friendship? And he challenges his interlocutors to define friendship. And they're all approximations that don't truly contain the essence of friendship. And Plato sort of has a dodge at the end, through Socrates, in which he says, perhaps friendship, therefore, is the process of debating with friends what it means to be a friend. Which isn't just a sophism or an eloquent thing to say, it's actually the introduction of a dialectic form of thought, which is to say, in the exchange, the questioning interaction, what is something really? You approach the essence of what it is precisely through the failure to properly acquire a notion of it. It's actually quite a paradoxical thought that Plato introduces, which actually later in Neoplatonism and Christianity becomes part of the dialectic of presence and absence, etc. You can always see traces of Platonic thought throughout the development of early Christian thought. But to go back to Aristotle, the division, therefore, is that Plato is interested in what things are. And he believes that if we can define what things are, then we can get towards the central truth. Aristotle believed against this, that if we could define what things were for, we could actually determine essence or truth. Which is to say, Plato introduced the notion that philosophy should be a demystifying process, a process by which you question everything, especially the things you thought you knew, to examine all of your blind spots, all of your assumptions and the things that you take for granted. Aristotle, against this, introduces the notion that if we observe the world around us and we try to understand its functioning and what purpose it serves, we can therefore understand its true nature. The problem, however, is that Aristotle thereby actually reintroduces what you might call normative thought back into the Platonic critical framework. A normative thought is a thought that tells you how to live or how to think. Something has to be in accordance with the good, or to put it in Greek terms, with virtue. As Oscar Wilde would later say, there's a difference between the Victorian idea of virtue and the Greek one. For the Victorians, virtue was about self-imposed prohibitions and morality, but for the Greeks, virtue was about how to live in accordance with the ideal, with the highest form of something, the highest good. Thereby, for example, the common good was a reflection of the divine good, etc. And Plato demystifies this constantly. He says, what does it actually mean to be free? What does it mean to be a friend? What does it mean to be good? And Aristotle tries to, in a sense, plug that gap by seeking certainty in the world of experience, phenomena, empirical reality, etc. And therefore you have two ideas of what philosophy is. You have the Platonic one, which is the question, what is the nature of something? And the Aristotelian one, which is, what purpose does something serve? And you can actually see this division running throughout the entire history of Western thought. The Aristotelian approach lends itself towards empiricism, towards an objective pursuit of knowledge in the world. Whereas the Platonic, quote-unquote, critical framework is something that you could see even in contemporary continental philosophy or even postmodernism or deconstructionism, etc. It's the idea that we should constantly seek to undermine certainty by means of imposing upon reality a critical framework, a critical inquiry. And in this sense, it's also important to note that philosophy from Plato onwards becomes about something that you do. It's not just what you think, it's specifically what you do with it. Like, the task of the philosopher is to seek truth by means of examining everything and subjecting it to scrutiny, to the mind, to thought. And I'm going to give you some more modern examples, modern in quotation marks, where you can see this Platonic task being carried forward. For example, in Nietzsche. The Nietzschean maxim that the best way to enslave a man is to convince him that he is free is a very Platonic idea. Because we take two things that appear self-evident. On the one hand, freedom, and to be unfree. And Nietzsche, in a very clever way, says that perhaps these categories need to be re-examined. Perhaps we are most unfree precisely when we are told that we are free. And although Nietzsche wasn't writing about capitalism, you could make the argument that within capitalism, the idea of individual gain, the idea of individual optimization and pursuits is sold to us as a form of freedom, when it is in fact not only the process by which we consider freedom as simply access to a consumer market, but the process by which we denigrate human existence into the reproduction of capitalist profit, which is to say, you only exist to the extent that you are productive. But that's not Nietzsche's point, but you can see, of course, that the Plato-Nietzsche capitalist critique has a through line. Plato says we must examine the self-evident categories of good versus evil, freedom versus unfreedom, and Nietzsche introduces a dialectical tension, if you will, by which the appearance of freedom becomes a way of being unfree, and therefore vice versa. To be truly free is to realize this very tension, the manner in which the notion of freedom under a current historical constellation obfuscates the very form of unfreedom. He takes what appears to be a binary and actually undermines it. Nietzsche does this quite consistently. For example, Nietzsche says that madness is the only form of truth. That in a world gone mad, to be mad is to be the last sane person. It's more than just a playful inversion, it's actually a distinctly Platonic way of approaching reality. Kant is perhaps, in many ways, the ultimate dialectical thinker, even more so than Hegel. It's just that Kant doesn't use this dialectical thought in a systemic way. Let me give you an example. Kant's idea about ethics and morality. It's so beautiful. It's very, very deft. Kant says that the reason the problem of ethics exists is because we don't know how to act. Like, think about the trolley problem. Like, it has no real solution. It forces us into an uncomfortable quandary in which we weigh the life of a few people against the life of many. Therefore, ethics for Kant appears almost as a form of wishful thinking, as a fantasy. If only we had a system of ethics that we could follow, knowing that it was a good reflection of divine will, everything would be perfect. It's almost like because we cannot choose how to act, we wish that ethics would do it for us. And against the backdrop of this impossibility emerges not only the potential, but indeed the necessity for morality. In other words, for Kant, morality isn't simply how one lives in accordance with the good, but rather the very real problem of having to choose what it means to be good against the backdrop of an absent authority, an absent universal reason that might guarantee an ethical action. And so morality appears both as the failure of ethics, the imminent impossibility of the ethical, inasmuch as it is therefore the possibility of subjective agency and true authentic freedom. And here again we have that Platonic notion. Yes, it's impossible to be truly ethical, if you think about it, but it is against the backdrop of this impossibility that we are compelled to be moral. And so it's more than an inversion, it's actually a way of emancipating the subject. It's a way of giving people the possibility of being truly free. That's the point of Platonic thinking. The task of philosophy is not only to live a rich life, but to live a free life. And for Plato, the idea is that to live a free life is to constantly examine the conditions of that which we know. Like, what is it that you actually know? I've talked about this before, like in my notes, I almost always start my notebook with the prompt, what do I know? I think this is like actually a way of doing like Platonic journaling almost. It's like to refuse to accept what exists as given. To look around your day-to-day life and to really subject it to thought and scrutiny. And there's something quite beautiful in this, I think, because when you move beyond normative thought, in other words, when you move beyond life that is simply prescriptive, here's how to do X, here's how to live like X, you actually, I think, can live a very rich and stimulating intellectual existence in which you'll find yourself enjoying the richness of ambiguity and complexity that surrounds us in our day-to-day life. There's the well-known maxim that art is the lie which tells the truth, or fiction is the lie which tells the truth. And in a sense, you could say that philosophy from Plato onwards is the abstraction or demystification that leads to truth. It's not a direct pathway from doubt to certainty. You don't go from not knowing to knowing. Rather, it's the other way around. You go from certainty to doubt. You go from I thought I knew everything to I don't know everything. And not only is there something very humble about that process, but I think there's something very important and very rich about being able to feel comfortable and to thrive amidst complexity and ambiguity. In fact, almost every political movement that has sought to repress the human spirit has tried to remove ambiguity from life, has tried to give us false certainties and easy ways of framing the world as good or bad. And that's not what it means to be free. What it means to be free is to be able to look straight at the world and understand that it is enormously contradictory, that pain and happiness can be intertwined, that freedom and unfreedom can be part of the same thing, that beauty and ugliness can coexist. To find these seemingly opposed poles and to actually see a certain truth in their very ambiguity is therefore what it means to think like a philosopher. And I think it's really Plato's accomplishment that he takes what is therefore a Socratic ethics, if you will, the idea that the unexamined life is not worth living, and that he tries to systematize it and therein introduces a way of thought that actually has ripple effects that continue until today. Now, I'd like to conclude this short lecture by perhaps thinking a little bit more about how this is something that you could take into your day-to-day life. There's a great line from Kafka that I always return to where he says, perhaps the right way to see something is to look at it the wrong way. I'm paraphrasing here. Or as Borges puts it, that he cannot offer you any answers, but he can simply offer you the old perplexities. And that is what philosophy is, I think. It's the invitation into a tradition of old perplexities. That there is something both incredibly energizing, but also humbling about the idea that you are stepping in the footsteps of an age-old tradition of personal critical emancipation and the idea that it is possible to live a free and rich existence. So what does it mean to live a free and rich existence? Well, I can only say that for me, it is that one is able to read and write, and that one is able to take in the world as something to be thought about. To apply thought to the world and to apply thought to one's own existence is therefore a way of living more free. To not reduce yourself to stock notions or cliches, to not simply be the passive consumer of prepackaged goods and ideas, but instead to constantly try to, in very gentle ways, push the boundaries of what exists and what can be done. I think one of the easiest ways to feel paralyzed and perhaps even alienated is to feel like there is no way to do things differently. There is no way to think or speak or create or live in a way that is different, that we all have to conform until we lose our identity, and perhaps more importantly, that the way in which we conform is precisely by pretending that we're all these unique original souls. That we wear logos that make us feel like a person because secretly we feel like maybe we don't know what life is about. And that isn't to judge anybody, because the whole point of life is that we don't know what it's about. The whole point of life is trying to find and impose some form of meaning upon it and to feel less alone. And I think it's so incredibly important to realize that philosophy, therefore, is not just something people do like professionally. It's like saying that someone's a professional anarchist. Like, the whole thing seems absurd to me, which isn't to be against professional philosophers, but instead I think it's very, very important to see that philosophy is ultimately a self-emancipatory practice. It is about the possibility of living a free and rich existence by means of imposing one's thought and applying one's thought upon the world. That the world, therefore, emerges as an object to be studied, but in that sense, an object to be paid attention to. And attention is a form of grace. That therefore, if we can think about the world and reflect upon it and actually notice and witness it and be present for it, we are partaking in an act of grace. That therefore both situates ourselves in the world, but in so doing also creates a life world in which we can thrive. And I think thereby also thrive with and for others. To me, that is the promise of education. It is the promise of a better life, a life that feels more rich in every way possible, and thereby more free. That is my short reflection on what you might call the life of the mind, or the idea that the unexamined life is not worth living, how to think like a philosopher, although by now you will understand that to put it in those terms is itself already a more normative idea rather than a truly philosophical one. I hope that this video finds you well, and I hope that you've enjoyed it. If you'd like to learn more about this, if you'd like to join our learning community and download my ebooks and lectures and be a part of this community, then please do consider becoming a patron on www.patreon.com/JulianPhilosophy. I will see you next week. And if you're wondering, this is indeed a different apartment because I am currently in Paris, where I will be for the next 4 weeks. A lovely place to read and think and teach and write, and hopefully share this space with you. See you soon.